Have you ever been in a moment where your silence felt heavier than your words? Where doing the right thing might cost you everything, your peace, your pride, maybe even your job? Picture this: a father, traveling with his young son on a calm morning flight. The world below is peaceful, the cabin quiet until one small act shatters it all. A flight attendant refuses to serve food to the boy, simply because of the color of his skin. The air freezes. Eyes turn away. No one moves. Now imagine it's your child, your flesh and blood sitting there, confused, hungry, humiliated. What would you do? Would you stay silent, afraid of the noise the truth might bring? Or would you stand up, knowing the world might never look at you the same again? That day, one man, a man who happened to be a CEO, made a choice that changed more than a flight. It changed lives. It challenged hearts. It forced people to look at kindness not as weakness, but as courage. Because sometimes a quiet voice in the right moment can echo louder than 1,000 speeches. This is not just a story about race or power. It's about empathy, dignity, and the strength it takes to remain human when the world forgets how. So, stay with me till the end and ask yourself one question. If you were on that plane, what would you have done? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you believe small acts of courage can still change the world. Let's begin the story. The silver cabin hummed with a steady, gentle vibration. Outside, morning light washed the wing of the plane in a quiet gold, a peaceful illusion 37,000 feet above the ground. Then, a sound broke the calm, the sharp scrape of a metal tray being pulled away. I said, "I'm not serving him." The words came cold, clipped, and clear. They sliced through the air like ice breaking on glass. For a second, no one moved. Forks froze halfway to mouths. A businessman in the aisle seat blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The little boy in seat 2B looked up, startled, his small hand still resting on the folded table in front of him. He was maybe 10, smooth, dark skin, wide brown eyes that held both curiosity and confusion. He wore a navy hoodie with a patch of a comic book hero stitched to the sleeve. Mason Cole quiet, polite, old enough to sense what had just happened, too young to understand why. Across from him sat his father, tall, composed, the kind of man whose presence filled a room without effort. Ethan Cole didn't look up right away. He exhaled slowly, eyes still on the window, watching clouds slide by like slow-moving waves. In first class, silence carried farther than sound. The flight attendant, Linda Harris, stood rigid, tray clutched to her chest. Her smile, the one she'd offered every other passenger, had vanished. What replaced it was something brittle, something almost defensive. The boy swallowed. "Ma'am, I didn't get my meal." Linda's lips tightened. "This section isn't for upgrades," she said. Her tone was quiet enough to sound professional, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You'll get snacks later." The businessman blinked again. The woman across the aisle glanced down, pretending to adjust her napkin. Nobody said a word. Mason looked at his father. Ethan's gaze met his for a heartbeat. No anger, no panic. Just calm, so calm it frightened Linda more than shouting ever could. He reached over, brushed a crumb from his son's sleeve. "It's all right, buddy." His voice was low, even. Don't worry about it. But the worry was already there, sitting heavy between them. Linda turned away, pushing her cart forward. The wheels squeaked once, twice. Then the sound faded toward the front of the cabin. Conversation returned in nervous fragments. A cough, a whisper. the soft click of a phone camera starting to record. Mason's stomach growled loud enough for the row behind to hear. He flushed and looked down. Ethan pretended not to notice. Instead, he adjusted his seat slightly, eyes still calm, but his jaw had tightened, barely visible, the way a mountain shifts beneath the snow. He'd seen this look before, years ago. Different setting, same script. When he was 12, a restaurant manager had refused to seat his family. Policy, the man had said, eyes avoiding theirs. His mother had smiled through it, whispering, "Hold your head high." Ethan, he had, but the sting had stayed. Now, decades later, it sat beside him again, disguised in a crisp uniform and a corporate smile. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning meal service shortly. Please remain seated." Mason let out a small breath that sounded like a question he was too scared to ask. His fingers toyed with the corner of his comic book. On the cover, a black superhero soared across the sky, fists blazing with light. Ethan leaned closer. "You okay?" Mason nodded quickly, eyes bright with the effort of holding tears back. "Yeah, Dad. I'm fine." "Good." Ethan's voice softened. "Remember what I told you before we boarded? About manners, about dignity?" He smiled faintly. "It's the one thing no one can take from you, unless you hand it over." The boy nodded. The plane dipped slightly, and a shaft of sunlight fell across their seats, catching the silver edge of Ethan's wedding ring. 2 rows ahead," a passenger whispered. "Did you see that?" "She skipped him." Another murmured, "That's messed up." Linda kept moving, pretending not to hear, but her neck flushed red above her collar. "In the galley?" She paused, staring at her reflection in the metal cabinet door. Her chest rose and fell quickly. "Just follow policy," she whispered to herself. "Keep things in order. Out in the cabin." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't angry, at least. Not yet. What he felt was something colder, steadier, the quiet awareness of injustice repeating itself, generation after generation. At 37,000 feet or at street level, it didn't matter. It always sounded the same. He opened his eyes and looked at his son, who was staring out the window at the endless sky. "Beautiful up here." "Huh?" "Yeah," Mason said softly. "Looks peaceful." "It can be," Ethan murmured. "But peace takes work." Somewhere behind them, a phone notification pinged. A passenger had posted a video. No one knew it yet. But those few seconds of cruelty, the skipped meal, the quiet humiliation would circle the internet within hours. Before the plane even touched down, millions would see it. For now, though, it was just a father and son, sitting quietly among strangers, the taste of injustice heavy in the recycled air. Ethan folded his hands, looked straight ahead, and waited. He'd promised himself long ago never to let anger make his choices. Not again. There would be a time to speak, but when he did, it would be with precision. Outside, the clouds broke open into brilliant light. The plane kept flying. The cameras kept recording. And the calm man in seat 2A was already deciding what kind of justice the sky would witness before it landed. The city was still half asleep when Ethan Cole stepped out of his brownstone home in Atlanta. The air carried that cool spring hush, where even the birds seemed to stretch before singing. He held 2 travel mugs of coffee, one dark roast for himself, one decaf with too much sugar for his son. Inside the doorway, Mason struggled with his shoelaces, brow furrowed like a soldier preparing for battle. "Dad, these laces hate me," he said. Ethan chuckled softly. "Laces don't hate, son. They just test patience." He knelt down, tying them in one smooth motion, and patience wins every time. The boy smiled, proud. Do I look like a first-class traveler? Now Ethan stood, brushing off Mason's hoodie. You look like someone who belongs anywhere. The line came easy, like something he'd said 100 times before. But today, it carried more weight than usual. Their flight to Denver was supposed to be routine. Ethan had meetings with Silver Wing Air's regional board. Mason had begged to come along, curious to see how airplanes are born, as he put it. Ethan had agreed, thinking it might be good for his son to see the world from higher ground. As they drove through quiet streets, sunlight began to leak over the horizon, streaking the sky with soft orange and gold. Mason hummed along to a song on the radio, tapping his sneakers against the seat. Ethan glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smiled faintly. He remembered his own father during long drives the way he'd hum old jazz tunes, the smell of tobacco and aftershave, the patience in his voice when the world wasn't fair. His father used to say, "Being black in America means sometimes you'll have to teach the world who you are before it tells you who you're not." Those words never left him. At the airport, the usual chaos awaited. Rolling suitcases, coffee lines, the hum of departures. People moved fast, eyes glued to screens, voices blending into a low human buzz. Mason clung to his small backpack, decorated with a patch of the superhero Black Falcon. Ethan noticed the patch had begun to peel at the edge. "You really like that hero." "Huh. He's brave," Mason said. "And he doesn't yell when people are mean to him. He just waits, then wins." Ethan smiled, something soft flickering behind his calm exterior. "Smart hero." They passed through security. A guard glanced at their tickets, then at Ethan's face, then back again. Ethan felt that subtle pause, the kind that lasts less than a second, but holds 1,000 stories. He'd lived long enough to recognize it, but he said nothing. Mason didn't notice. He was too busy watching planes taxi outside the massive glass windows, pointing with awe. "Dad, do you ever get tired of flying?" Ethan shook his head. "No." "Son, I get tired of landing." It wasn't a joke, though Mason laughed anyway. Inside the terminal, Ethan bought a small sandwich and orange juice for Mason, just in case. He knew airplane food could be unpredictable, even in first class. "You eat this later if you get hungry," he said. "Okay. But Mom says plane food is fancy." Ethan chuckled. "Mom hasn't flown as much as I have." The gate attendant recognized Ethan, though she didn't say anything. Being the CEO of a major airline meant constant travel, but he preferred anonymity when he could. He'd learned that true authority didn't need a badge or a title. It spoke for itself when the time was right. When they boarded, Mason's excitement was contagious. "Dad, this is huge," he whispered, touching the seat controls. "It's like a spaceship." Ethan smiled. "Just remember, you're here to relax, not to pilot." The boy grinned, buckling himself in. Yes, Captain Dad. The flight attendants greeted passengers with polished smiles. Ethan nodded politely. Linda Harris was among them, her name tag glinting under the cabin light. She greeted everyone with the same scripted warmth, though something in her eyes flickered when she reached Ethan and Mason. A half-second hesitation. It was barely there, but Ethan noticed. He always noticed. She moved on. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, centering his thoughts. Years in leadership had taught him that you can't stop prejudice from existing, but you can choose how to face it. As the plane ascended, Mason pressed his face against the window. "We're so high," he said. "Do you think we can see heaven from here?" Ethan smiled quietly. "If you look with the right eyes, maybe." The hum of the engine settled into a rhythm. Cabin lights dimmed. The world below blurred into clouds. For a while, it was peaceful. Mason flipped through his comic book while Ethan reviewed a document on his tablet. But every so often, his gaze drifted to his son, curious, gentle, unguarded. Ethan envied that innocence, the way Mason still believed the world was mostly fair. He didn't want to take that from him. Not yet. The captain's voice echoed softly over the speaker. "Good morning, folks. This is your captain, James Reeves. We're cruising at 37,000 feet. It's a beautiful day to fly." Ethan smiled faintly. He knew Reeves personally. A good man, the kind who treated everyone the same, from janitors to board members. A flight attendant passed by offering drinks. Linda followed close behind with the meal cart, her perfume faint but sharp. Mason looked up eagerly. That was when Ethan felt it. A subtle shift in the air, the same kind of stillness that comes right before a storm. He looked up, saw Linda glance at them, then move on without stopping, her expression unreadable, but her intent unmistakable. Mason blinked. Did she miss us? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Maybe she'll come back, but she didn't. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. His voice stayed even. His posture didn't change. Yet inside, something stirred. Not rage, but memory. The echo of countless small indignities born with grace until they weren't small anymore. He looked out the window again, the vast blue stretching endlessly. There was a time when he'd fought back with words, fire, arguments, but power. He'd learned. Wasn't in volume. It was in timing. He reached over, adjusting Mason's seatbelt. Comfy. Yeah. When do we get food soon, buddy? Ethan smiled gently, though his eyes were elsewhere. The calm before justice is always quiet. And in that silence, Ethan Cole, CEO, father, man who had spent his life balancing grace against prejudice, was already deciding how far he'd let this go before the sky itself bore witness. The hum of the engines continued steady and soft, like a heartbeat counting down. Soon, words would be spoken that neither of them could ever forget. But for now, in that stillness above the clouds, Ethan simply watched his son's reflection in the window and whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "Not this time." The morning sunlight outside the cabin had turned into a soft haze. Somewhere over Tennessee, the plane glided through pale clouds that looked like frozen waves. The hum of the engines was steady, hypnotic, almost peaceful. Inside the first-class cabin, time moved differently. People scrolled through their phones, whispered about meetings, watched movies through half-open eyelids. Everything felt normal until it didn't. Linda Harris rolled her cart down the aisle with a practiced smile. The kind of smile you learn from years of customer service training. Polite, but distant. She moved efficiently, asking each passenger, "Chicken or pasta?" The smell of buttered rolls filled the air, warm and comforting. Mason watched with eager eyes, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Ethan noticed the excitement in his son's face and smiled faintly. "You like this part?" "Huh," Mason nodded. "I like how everything looks fancy, even the napkin." "Enjoy it," Ethan said softly. "Not everyone gets to see the world from up here." Linda reached the row ahead of them, serving two women who laughed quietly at a shared joke. Then she turned, her eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan and Mason. Her hand hovered over the meal tray for a moment, but she didn't stop. She pushed the cart forward. Mason blinked. Maybe she forgot Ethan's tone was calm. Maybe. Linda kept moving, chatting politely with the next passenger. "Would you like sparkling water or still?" Her voice was warm again, the kind that carries to the nearby rows. Mason's smile began to fade. He looked down at his folded hands, his small shoulders lowering. Ethan watched without moving. Years of boardroom meetings had taught him that stillness could be more powerful than reaction. But this wasn't business. This was his son. The businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable, glancing between Linda and the boy, then back at his laptop as if pretending not to notice made him less guilty for being silent. A few rows back, someone lifted a phone subtly, pretending to scroll, but pressing record. The lens caught Mason's face, the confusion mixed with a shy attempt to stay polite. Linda turned back down the aisle, smiling at other passengers. When she reached Ethan's row again, Mason tried once more, his voice small but steady. "Excuse me, ma'am, I think you missed us." Linda paused, her smile thinning. "I didn't miss you. Sweetheart, we're not serving upgraded passengers for this meal." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Upgraded?" She looked at him, her tone still polite but laced with quiet irritation. "Yes, sir. We have a separate menu for economy upgrades. Those meals come later." Ethan's eyes were calm, searching hers. "That's interesting," he said softly, "because these seats weren't upgraded." Linda hesitated, realizing she'd stepped into unfamiliar territory. "Oh, well, perhaps there's been a mix-up. I'll check." But she didn't check. She turned the cart and kept moving. Mason looked at his father again. "It's okay. Dad, I'm not that hungry." Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides too much. "I know, buddy." The engines hummed, the plane cutting through invisible air. Linda disappeared into the galley. Mason turned toward the window, watching the sky blur into white and gray. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than he felt. After a moment, Ethan leaned closer. "You brought that sandwich." "Right." Mason nodded and reached into his backpack, pulling out the small foil-wrapped sandwich his mother had made. He opened it carefully, like it was something sacred. The smell of turkey and cheese filled the air. Before he could take a bite, Linda appeared again, voice sharp but quiet. "Sir, outside food isn't allowed in this cabin." Ethan's head turned slightly. "Excuse me." She folded her arms, her posture firm. "Company policy. We don't allow passengers to eat homemade food in first class. It's unsanitary." The businessman looked up again, frowning. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "That's not a thing." Is it Ethan's voice stayed steady? "You've already decided what kind of passenger we are, haven't you?" Linda blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said softly. "You meant we don't belong here." Her jaw tightened. "Sir, please don't raise your voice." Ethan hadn't raised his voice at all. He spoke the way calm water sounds when it hits stone quiet, but unyielding. "I haven't," he said, "but you should listen anyway." The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the air felt different, heavier. Mason shifted nervously. "Dad, it's fine. I'll just wait." Ethan looked at him and smiled with quiet pride. "You don't have to wait. Son, you've done nothing wrong." He turned back to Linda. "We'll finish this conversation when you're ready to treat us like the paying passengers we are." Linda hesitated, muttered something under her breath, and turned away. The man behind Ethan leaned forward slightly. "That was messed up," he whispered. "You handled that better than I would have." Ethan smiled politely. "Anger doesn't change hearts. It only proves them right. The man nodded slowly. Still, someone should say something. Someone just did. Ethan replied. He turned to his son again. Mason had gone quiet, staring down at his hands. Ethan placed a palm gently on his shoulder. You did nothing wrong, Mason. Sometimes people see only what they want to see. Mason's voice was small. Is it because of how we look? Ethan took a slow breath. Maybe. But what matters is how we respond. Do you understand? I think so. Good. Then keep your head high. A few seats away, an older woman with silver hair watched them closely. Her name was Nancy Miller. She'd been a teacher for 40 years, and she recognized shame when she saw it. She quietly reached into her bag and took out a pack of honey cookies, smiling kindly at Mason. He hesitated, glancing at his dad. Ethan nodded softly, but before Mason could take one, Linda appeared again, her voice cutting through the moment. Ma'am, please refrain from sharing food. It's against policy. Nancy's voice was firm, gentle, but unafraid. Policy doesn't feed a hungry child. The sentence hung in the air like thunder in the distance. Linda blinked, caught between authority and guilt. Then she turned sharply and walked back toward the galley, her shoes clicking like punctuation marks in the silence she'd left behind. Ethan looked at Nancy and mouthed, Thank you. She smiled. The world's watching, whether they know it or not. Ethan nodded. He glanced at Mason, who smiled back shyly, holding his head a little higher now. The hum of the engines returned, soft but insistent. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom with routine announcements, but nobody was listening. The air felt charged, like the sky was holding its breath. Ethan leaned back in his seat, eyes calm again. Inside, though, something shifted. The line had been crossed, and he knew it. He'd given grace its chance. The next time, he wouldn't stay silent. Outside, sunlight spilled through the windows, catching the edge of his wristwatch, a gift from his father with an engraving inside that read, Strength is quiet until it speaks. The plane continued forward, unaware that a story was already unfolding that would echo across the country within hours. And Ethan Cole sat on the calm before the storm, waiting not for justice, but for the right moment to deliver it. The quiet stretched for minutes that felt like hours. The hum of the engines filled the silence left behind by the confrontation. People went back to pretending they were busy, pretending they hadn't seen what happened, pretending their hearts weren't still racing a little. The clinking of silverware up ahead sounded almost cruel now, like a reminder that some people got to eat while others were told to wait. Mason stared down at the small sandwich resting in his hands. The foil was warm from his palms. He could still hear Linda's words echoing faintly in his mind. Words that didn't sound like rules. They sounded like rejection. Outside food isn't allowed in this cabin. It wasn't just about the sandwich anymore. It was about being told that he didn't belong, even when his ticket said he did. He looked at his father. Ethan was calm, but his eyes were distant, focused somewhere past the window. The light that filtered through the glass painted the side of his face in soft gold, but there was steel in his expression. He didn't move, didn't frown, didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, the way a storm waits before it breaks. "Dad," Mason whispered, his voice small, uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan turned to him slowly. His tone was gentle, almost too calm. "No, son, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people just forget who they're talking to." Mason frowned, confused. "You mean they forget to be nice?" Ethan smiled faintly. Something like that. A soft laugh came from across the aisle. Nancy Miller, the elderly teacher, had been pretending to read a magazine. She looked over her glasses now, her eyes kind but sharp. "Your father's right, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sometimes adults need lessons, too." Mason nodded quietly, clutching his sandwich. He wanted to eat it, but now it felt heavier than before. The wrapper crinkled softly in his fingers, the sound loud against the hush of the cabin. Ethan reached out and touched his shoulder. "Go ahead, son. Eat. Don't let anyone make you feel small for needing something as simple as lunch." Mason hesitated. "But what if she comes back?" Ethan leaned closer, his voice low. "Then she'll come back, and she'll find out who she's dealing with." There was something in his tone steady, grounded, the kind of quiet confidence that makes people lean in. Mason didn't fully understand it, but he trusted it. He took a bite. The sandwich was ordinary white bread, turkey, cheese, but it tasted like courage. Up front, Linda was in the galley whispering to another attendant. "He's feeding the boy from outside food," she hissed. "It's against protocol." The other attendant, a younger woman named Carla, frowned. "Linda, just let it go. He's a kid. It's not a big deal." "It is when I say it is," Linda snapped. "You saw the seating chart? They're not on the manifest for premium meals. I'm not risking my job over people who shouldn't even be up here." Carla hesitated. Something in Linda's tone made her stomach twist. "You might want to be careful," she said quietly. "That man doesn't look like someone you want to test." Linda scoffed. "He's just another pushy passenger trying to look important. Trust me, I've dealt with worse." She straightened her uniform, lifted her chin, and walked back out with the kind of confidence that only ignorance could sustain. As she entered the aisle again, she saw Mason chewing quietly, his sandwich half gone. Her steps slowed. "Sir," she said sharply, "I asked you not to eat outside food." Ethan looked up. "You asked. I didn't agree." Her eyes narrowed. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have to file an incident report." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "File whatever you need to. I'll be filing one too." Several passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between them. The air felt charged again. Linda's smile was tight. "Sir, if you continue to be uncooperative, I'll have to report you to the captain." Ethan's tone dropped a register. "That's a good idea. Let's do that." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority. The kind of authority that didn't need explaining. Mason froze, unsure what to do. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Finish your lunch. Mason, you're fine." Linda turned on her heel and strode toward the front of the cabin. The businessman from before leaned forward again, whispering, "She's picking the wrong fight." Ethan smiled without looking at him. She doesn't know that yet. Up ahead, Linda knocked softly on the cockpit door. "Captain Reeves, can I have a word?" The captain glanced back. "We're mid-flight." "Linda, what's wrong?" "There's a passenger refusing to follow food policy," she said. Reeves frowned. "Refusing to follow? What outside food? In first class?" The co-pilot looked at her incredulously. "That's not a policy." Linda crossed her arms. "It's a safety concern." Reeves sighed. "Linda, we've flown together long enough for me to know when something's not about safety. I'll come check in a bit." She opened her mouth to argue, but the captain turned back to the controls, ending the conversation. When Linda returned to the cabin, she felt every eye on her. The same passengers who'd looked away earlier were watching now, their phones quietly raised. She pasted on her professional smile and walked past Ethan's row. her jaw tight. Mason finished the last bite of his sandwich. He leaned back, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "That was good," he said softly. "Thanks, Dad." Ethan smiled. "You're welcome." For the first time since the flight began, Mason relaxed. He opened his comic book again, flipping through pages filled with heroes who looked like him, strong, brave, standing tall against the impossible. He traced one of the panels with his finger. "Black Falcon never lets the bad guys win," he said. Ethan nodded. "That's because he knows when to stand up." "Will we stand up too?" "Oh, we will," Ethan said. "But not just yet." The older woman, Nancy, smiled faintly at the exchange. She leaned back in her seat and whispered to herself, "There's a storm coming, and that woman doesn't even feel the wind." Minutes passed. The sky outside had deepened into a brighter blue, the clouds forming patterns that looked almost like waves crashing against each other. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be over Kansas in about 20 minutes. Smooth flying ahead." Ethan closed his eyes, resting his head back. Mason's breathing had slowed, the comic resting on his chest. He'd fallen asleep. Ethan watched him for a moment. His son looked peaceful, untouched by the ugliness of what had just happened. But Ethan knew the world didn't stay kind for long. He thought about all the times he'd sat quietly in meetings where people underestimated him, where his ideas were questioned until someone else repeated them in a different voice. He'd learned to choose his battles wisely. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was his son's first lesson in how the world sometimes treats people who look like them. And he would make sure that lesson ended differently. When Mason stirred in his sleep, Ethan leaned close and whispered, "You belong everywhere, son. Don't ever forget that." At the front of the cabin, Linda poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. The whispers, the stares, the tension, it all pressed on her like invisible weight. But pride kept her standing. She muttered quietly, "He thinks he's special. They always do." She didn't notice the reflection in the polished metal door behind her, Ethan, standing now, calm and composed, making his way toward the front of the cabin. The passenger's eyes followed him. Phones were lifted again. Something was about to happen. And for the first time, even the engine seemed to quiet, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The sound of the engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat. Every vibration carried through the seats, through the quiet, through the rising tension that had settled like fog. The flight was halfway to Denver, the sky outside stretching endless and bright. But inside, the air was thick with unspoken things. Ethan walked slowly toward the front of the plane, each step measured, deliberate. He wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. His face was calm, his stride even, but his presence carried something heavy, something that made people stop mid-sentence, lower their phones, and just watch. Linda was refilling coffee cups near the galley, her movements sharp and mechanical. She looked up, startled when she saw him coming. For a brief second, she straightened her posture and forced a professional smile. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're in mid-flight." Ethan stopped just a few feet away. His voice was soft, but it filled the small space between them completely. "You said something about policy earlier?" Linda blinked. "Yes, sir." "About outside food." "Right," Ethan said quietly. "I'd like to see that policy." She hesitated, glancing around. "It's internal. Crew documentation." "Then call your supervisor," Ethan replied. "Or better yet, the captain." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir, this isn't the time." "It is," Ethan said. His tone didn't rise, but the calm in his voice made her flinch. "Because my son deserves to know why you thought he didn't belong here. And I'd like to hear you say it out loud." A soft murmur spread through the cabin. People were watching now. Phones discreetly raised, their reflections glimmering in the windows. Linda's face flushed red. "Sir, I don't appreciate your implication." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "And I don't appreciate your behavior." The younger attendant, Carla, appeared behind her, uneasy. "Linda, maybe we should just let this go." But Linda forced a smile again. "I'm following procedure. I treat everyone the same." Ethan's eyes were steady. "No, you don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't have walked past a hungry child twice." Her mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment, the only sound was the engine hum and the faint clinking of glasses from somewhere down the aisle. From her seat, Nancy Miller spoke, her voice calm but firm. "He's right. We all saw it. Every single one of us." The businessman across the aisle nodded. "You skipped the kid, lady. That's on camera." Linda turned, her composure cracking. "You don't understand." Ethan took one small step closer. "Then help us understand." She hesitated again, her voice catching. "It's not about race. I just thought they were upgrades." Ethan's expression didn't change. "You thought wrong." Linda's eyes flickered with something defensive, then frightened. "I'm sorry if you felt mistreated." "Sir," Ethan exhaled slowly, "that's not an apology. That's an escape." The tension in the cabin thickened. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting for what would happen next. The captain's voice came suddenly over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. Flight attendants, please check the cabin. We're experiencing light turbulence." The timing felt almost poetic. The plane dipped slightly, and everyone held their breath as it steadied again. Ethan looked toward the cockpit. "Good," he murmured. "He's awake." He turned back to Linda. "Since we're experiencing turbulence, why don't we keep things clear between us?" Linda swallowed hard. "Sir, please." I didn't mean. Ethan raised a hand. Stopping her, his voice was calm, even softer now. "You didn't mean to show your bias. I know. Most people never do. But intent doesn't erase impact." A few passengers nodded subtly. A woman whispered, "That's exactly it." Ethan continued, his words slow and deliberate. "You see, I've spent my life around people who mistake silence for weakness. They see patience as permission. But patience, Miss Harris, is just power waiting for precision." Linda's face drained of color. Her name tag glinted in the overhead light like a small, trembling mirror. Ethan turned slightly, gesturing toward Mason, who was now awake, watching quietly from his seat. "My son sat there, in front of the entire cabin, wondering if he did something wrong. He asked me that question, and do you know how that feels? To see a child start to believe he's the problem." Linda's eyes welled up. I didn't mean to make him feel that way." Ethan nodded once. "But you did." The entire cabin was silent now. Even the flight attendants in the back had stopped moving. Carla's hand trembled slightly as she held a tray of cups, unsure what to do. Then Ethan spoke again, his tone still low, but there was a quiet finality to it. "You work for Silver Wing Air." "Correct." Linda hesitated. "Yes." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black leather wallet. From it, he removed a sleek metal card, the kind that caught the light like glass. It had a single engraved logo, Silver Wing Air. Her breath caught. "What is that?" Ethan looked at it, then back at her. Identification. He held it where she could see. Ethan Cole, CEO. The words hit harder than any shout ever could. A few gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Linda's knees seemed to buckle slightly. "Sir, I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Ethan said quietly. "You didn't care enough to—" Tears filled her eyes. "Please, I can explain." Ethan shook his head. "You've already explained. Every word, every look, every choice. You wrote your explanation before I stood up." He stepped aside and looked down the aisle toward Mason. The boy's face was a mix of confusion and awe. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's okay, son. You don't have to say anything." Then he turned back to Linda. "You may want to call the captain. He'll need to know that one of his crew is no longer employed by this company." Her lips parted, trembling. "You can't just I can," Ethan said. "And I am." Carla dropped the tray she was holding. Cups rolled down the aisle as passengers murmured, stunned. Ethan looked toward the front again. "Captain Reeves," he called evenly. The cockpit door opened a crack, and the captain leaned out, his expression cautious. "Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded politely. "Good afternoon. James. I think we need to make a quick personnel adjustment." The captain blinked, then glanced at Linda, who stood frozen, her face pale. He sighed heavily. "Understood, sir." Ethan turned back to her one last time. "You'll be escorted off when we land. You'll have time to think about what professionalism means, and more importantly, what humanity means." Linda's tears fell silently as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Ethan's expression softened slightly, not from pity, but from clarity. "Then start there." He turned and walked back toward his seat, the murmur of whispers following him like a slow wave. Mason looked up as he approached, eyes wide. "Dad, are you in trouble?" Ethan smiled gently. "No, son. Sometimes doing the right thing just looks loud to the wrong people." Mason nodded slowly, his small hands fidgeting with his comic book. "You weren't loud, though." Ethan chuckled softly. "That's because real power never needs to be." The plane steadied again. Passengers began to talk in quiet tones. Nancy wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering, "About time someone stood up." Ethan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. The tension in his chest loosened. It wasn't triumph, he felt it was relief. The kind that comes when truth finally speaks out loud. Outside, the sky opened up, the clouds parting into a wide expanse of gold and blue. The light washed over the cabin, warm and forgiving. Mason leaned against his father's arm, whispering, "You're kinda like Black Falcon." "Huh." Ethan smiled. "Not quite, son. Black Falcon saves the world. I just fix what's broken in front of me." Mason grinned, his eyes bright again. "That's kind of the same thing." Ethan looked out the window, watching the sunlight streak across the wing. Maybe you're right. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale completely. The storm had broken, but in its place came something lighter, quieter. Justice had spoken, and it hadn't needed to shout. The world outside the window had changed again. The endless blue sky was giving way to distant mountains, their snowy peaks glowing in afternoon light. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Denver. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure your trays are in the upright position. We'll be on the ground shortly." Ethan looked down at his watch. It had been just over 3 hours since they left Atlanta, but it felt like a lifetime. Mason sat beside him, his comic book forgotten, eyes fixed on the small oval window as if watching the world rebuild itself beneath the plane. All around them, people whispered in low voices. Phones were out again, messages being sent, videos being uploaded. The moment that had started as quiet humiliation was now becoming something else, a story, one that would soon belong to the entire internet. But for Ethan, none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the boy beside him, his son, who had seen the world at its smallest and largest in the same afternoon. Mason turned from the window and looked up at his father. "Dad, are you mad?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A little, but not at you." "Are you mad at the lady?" He thought about it. The easy answer would have been yes, but honesty carried more weight. "I'm mad at what she's learned to believe." People can live their whole lives thinking some folks don't belong where they are. It's a kind of blindness, son. The dangerous kind. Mason frowned thoughtfully. "You fired her." "Right, I did," Ethan said, "but not to punish her. I did it so she'd stop hurting people in small ways that grow into big ones." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing each word like he always did. "Do you think she'll learn?" Ethan sighed softly. "I hope so." The engines lowered their tone as the plane began to descend. The cabin tilted slightly, and sunlight poured through the windows, painting stripes across Mason's face. Ethan reached out and brushed his son's hair from his eyes. "You okay?" "Yeah," Mason said. "I just keep thinking about when she said I didn't belong. It made me feel weird, like maybe she saw something bad in me that I couldn't see." Ethan's heart tightened. "She didn't see you, Mason. She saw her own fear. And sometimes fear looks for someone else to blame. Is that what you see when people are mean?" He smiled gently. "Sometimes. Other times I just see tired souls who forgot how to be kind." Mason thought about that. "That sounds sad." "It is," Ethan said quietly. "But that's why we can't let it make us like them." A soft chime sounded through the cabin, and the seatbelt sign lit up. Passengers began packing away tablets and headphones, the quiet rustle of belongings replacing the tension from earlier in the front galley. Linda sat stiffly on a jump seat, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Carla stood nearby, her expression torn between sympathy and disbelief. Linda whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Carla exhaled slowly. "Sometimes. Linda, I didn't mean to isn't enough. You hurt that kid. And his father. He's not just anyone." "I know," Linda murmured, her voice breaking. "But it wasn't about race. It was just—" She trailed off because even she didn't believe the words anymore. Carla looked toward Ethan's row. He was sitting quietly, his hand resting on his son's shoulder, the two of them silhouetted against the fading light. "You picked the wrong man to underestimate," she said softly. Back in the cabin, a few passengers made small talk with Ethan, polite words filled with gratitude. The businessman from earlier leaned over. "You handled that like a pro," he said. "I don't know if I could have stayed that calm." Ethan smiled slightly. "Calm isn't easy, but it's the only language some people understand." Nancy, the older woman, smiled from across the aisle. "Your son will remember this day. You know." Ethan nodded. "I hope he remembers the right parts." "What parts are those?" "The part where kindness won," he said. Nancy's smile deepened. "That's a good thing to remember." The plane began to shake slightly as it cut through a patch of turbulence. Mason grabbed his father's hand instinctively. Ethan squeezed it once, reassuringly. "We're fine," he said softly. "Just bumps in the air." Mason smiled nervously. Like people. Huh? Ethan chuckled. Exactly like people. The turbulence eased, and the view outside grew clearer. The sprawling suburbs, the silver line of highways, the distant mountains. Denver was waiting below, steady and bright. When the wheels touched down, the sound filled the cabin like applause from the earth itself. The passengers clapped softly, a tradition that felt more heartfelt this time. For the first time since takeoff, Linda didn't stand to lead the routine announcements. Carla took over instead. Welcome to Denver, everyone. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Her voice trembled just slightly, but it carried a quiet respect. As the plane slowed, Linda stood and approached Ethan's row hesitantly. Her steps were small, uncertain. The world outside was still rolling past the windows, but her entire focus was on him. Miss Cole, she said softly, may I speak with you for a moment? Ethan looked up, his face unreadable. Of course. She clasped her hands together. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly. I know that doesn't fix what happened, but I needed to say it before we land. Ethan nodded once, his tone measured. Apology accepted. She blinked, surprised. Just like that. He looked at her steadily. You apologized. You meant it. The next step is yours, not mine. Linda swallowed hard. Huh? I understand. Mason watched quietly as his father spoke. There was no anger left, no trace of triumph, only grace the kind that disarms without force. Linda wiped at her eyes, whispered another thank you, and turned away. She sat back down near the galley, her hands shaking. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. But maybe that was the start of something good. As passengers began to stand, gathering their bags, Ethan stayed seated. Mason looked up. Aren't we going? Dad, in a minute, Ethan said softly. Let everyone rush first. We don't need to be first to be right. The line of passengers moved slowly down the aisle. Some stopped briefly to nod at Ethan or pat him on the shoulder. One woman whispered, You did the right thing. Another murmured, That needed to happen. When they finally stepped into the aisle, Mason turned back to glance at Linda. She was sitting quietly, head down, eyes glistening. He hesitated, then lifted a small hand in a wave. Linda looked up, startled. Then she smiled weakly and whispered, I'm sorry, kid. Mason nodded once. It's okay. Ethan watched the exchange, a faint smile touching his lips. The boy was learning the most important lesson of all, not vengeance, but forgiveness. As they stepped out into the jet bridge, the first cool breath of Denver air met them. It smelled like metal and rain. Mason took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Dad, he said, I think that lady felt bad for real. Ethan nodded. I think she did too. Do you think people can change that fast? Sometimes it takes one moment, Ethan said. The right moment. They walked together through the terminal, the sound of rolling suitcases echoing around them. Passengers from their flight whispered quietly as they passed, but Ethan ignored it. He didn't need the attention. He just needed to get his son home. Mason tugged on his sleeve. Dad, when I grow up, can I work for Silverwing too? Ethan smiled. You can do anything you want. Mason, just remember what we stand for. What's that respect? He said. And courage? The kind that doesn't shout, but never backs down. Outside, the sunlight was soft and low, turning the windows of the terminal into sheets of gold. Ethan stopped for a moment, looking out at the runway where other planes waited to rise. Mason followed his gaze. It's pretty. Huh. Ethan nodded. It is. Every takeoff means another chance to do better. They stood there quietly for a few seconds before walking toward the exit, the crowd moving around them like a slow river. For a brief moment, Ethan turned back toward the gate, where Linda was being escorted out by airport staff. Their eyes met through the distance. She gave a small nod, and he returned it a silent agreement that the story didn't have to end with anger. And then, as they disappeared into the moving crowd, the words he had whispered earlier returned to him, echoing in his mind. Justice flies higher than prejudice. This time, it didn't sound like a statement. It sounded like truth. The sun had dipped low by the time Ethan and Mason stepped into the car waiting outside Denver International. The day had stretched itself thin, full of noise, silence, and lessons neither of them would soon forget. Mason was tired, but his eyes still carried that quiet glow of curiosity. He pressed his forehead against the window, watching the skyline move by like a slow dream. In the front seat, the driver, a friendly man named Harold, glanced back through the mirror. "Rough flight?" he asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "You could say that." Harold chuckled. "I saw something online earlier. Some folks were talking about a flight from Atlanta. Sounded like a mess. Guy stood up to a rude flight attendant or something. You hear about that?" Ethan's gaze drifted to the window. The city lights began to flicker to life below the fading sky. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I heard." Harold laughed again, not noticing the weight behind the words. "Good on that guy. The world needs more people like him. Ain't right how folks still act these days." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The phone in his pocket was already buzzing nonstop, messages pouring in faster than he could read them. Texts from colleagues, friends, even journalists. He turned the screen over, letting it rest face down on the seat beside him. Some things could wait. In the back seat, Mason stirred. "Dad, why are people texting you so much work stuff?" Ethan said. "Nothing we need to worry about tonight." The boy smiled sleepily. "You mean people saw the video?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe." Mason's head tilted slightly. "Do you think they'll be mad at you?" "Some will," Ethan said honestly. "But others might finally understand why I had to speak." The drive was long and quiet, filled with the soft hum of tires on asphalt. Mason dozed off before they reached the hotel. Ethan carried him upstairs, his small arms draped over his father's shoulder, his breath steady against his neck. Inside the suite, Ethan laid him gently on the bed and stood for a moment, watching his son sleep. The innocence of that moment cut through everything else. He walked to the window. The city spread out beneath him, alive with motion and light. Cars crawled through streets like tiny rivers of gold. Ethan took a deep breath and finally turned his phone face up. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages. The first notification made his chest tighten an alert from Silver Wing Air's communications team. The headline on the news app below it read, "Airline CEO confronts racism mid-flight." Ethan sighed. He'd known it was coming. There was no way something like that would stay private in a world that never stopped recording. Still, seeing it written in bold felt surreal. He tapped open one message from his communications director. "Diana, the video's gone viral. Major outlets are picking it up. Public response overwhelmingly supportive. We're preparing a statement." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. He wasn't sure how to feel: vindicated, exhausted, or maybe just exposed. All he'd wanted was for his son to be treated like everyone else. He hadn't planned on becoming a headline. A few hours later, the story was everywhere. News anchors replayed the clip on repeat the moment Ethan stood up. The calm in his voice, the stunned silence afterward. Some called it an act of quiet heroism. Others debated whether he'd overstepped. The internet was divided as always, but one thing was certain: the world had seen what happened. In an office hundreds of miles away, the Silver Wing Air Board convened an emergency video call. Faces appeared in small squares, lit by the glow of laptop screens. The chairman, a stern man named Robert Hale, spoke first. "We've confirmed authenticity. The incident is real. Public sentiment is largely in favor of Mr. Cole's actions." One executive frowned. "It's a PR nightmare for the flight crew, but a win for the company. Our CEO defending fairness midair." "That's powerful." Robert nodded slowly. "Yes, but it also opens doors we'll have to walk through. Policy reviews, retraining, public accountability." "Then we walk through them," said another voice. "That's leadership." Back in Denver, Ethan sat by the window, phone still buzzing. He scrolled through comments on social media, some angry, most inspired. One post caught his attention. It was from Nancy Miller, the elderly passenger who had defended Mason. She'd written, "I was there. What I saw wasn't confrontation. It was grace. The kind of grace that changes people." Thousands of likes followed. Ethan smiled faintly. Grace. The word lingered in his mind like a soft echo. In the next room, Mason woke and padded sleepily toward his father. "Dad," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "The TV's talking about you?" Ethan turned. "Yeah, I figured. They said you're a hero." Ethan crouched down, looking his son in the eye. "You know what a hero really is. Mason." The boy shook his head. "It's someone who does the right thing even when no one's watching," Ethan said quietly. "Today, I didn't do anything special. I just stopped pretending not to see." Mason yawned and nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "Mom's going to be proud." Ethan laughed softly. "I hope so." The next morning, they met with Silver Wing's Denver team. The meeting was formal but supportive. Public relations had crafted a statement, though Ethan insisted on writing his own. The words came slowly, measured like everything else he did. At Silver Wing Air, dignity isn't optional. It's as essential as flight itself. What happened aboard Flight 227 wasn't about policy, it was about humanity. We're committed to ensuring that everyone who steps onto our planes feels valued, respected, and seen. When the statement was released, it spread like wildfire. News outlets called it one of the most honest corporate responses in years. For Ethan, it wasn't about damage control. It was about truth. A few days later, Linda Harris requested a private meeting. Against the advice of some executives, Ethan agreed. They met in a small conference room at headquarters. She looked smaller now, her confidence stripped bare. Her eyes were tired, but sincere. "Mr. Cole," she began softly, "I wanted to say thank you for listening, for not destroying me publicly." Ethan nodded. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped pretending it was invisible." She nodded slowly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about why I acted that way. I can't change what I did, but I can change what comes after." "That's what matters," Ethan said. She looked up. "I want to help, maybe in the company's diversity program or the community outreach team. If you'll let me." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "You'll have to earn that, but everyone deserves a second chance if they're willing to do the work." Tears filled her eyes again. "I am..." "Then start today," Ethan said. When she left, the air felt lighter. Not because the problem was solved, but because something real had shifted. That night, Ethan returned home to Atlanta with Mason. Their house was quiet. The familiar hum of the neighborhood wrapping around them like a blanket. Mason ran straight to his mother, shouting the story with all the energy a child could muster. Ethan stood in the doorway, smiling, the exhaustion of the week settling into his bones. His wife, Alicia, looked at him with soft pride. You didn't just stand up for him, Ethan. You stood up for everyone who's ever been told to sit down. He kissed her forehead. I just did what any father would. Later, after Mason had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the porch, the warm southern air heavy with the scent of magnolias. The stars above were sharp and bright. He thought about how quickly one quiet act could ripple through so many lives. The world was still imperfect, still divided, but tonight it felt just a little bit better. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the moment settle. In the distance, a plane crossed the sky, its lights blinking softly against the dark. Ethan smiled. Justice, he thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flies quietly, just high enough for the whole world to see. The morning light in Atlanta came soft through the curtains, touching the living room floor like calm water. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand. It had been a week since the flight, but the echoes of that day still filled the air. His phone was quiet now. The first storm of media had passed, replaced by emails from advocacy groups, invitations to speak, and letters from parents who said his story gave them courage. On social media, clips of him standing in the aisle kept circulating, set to soft music and captions about dignity. He hadn't watched any of them. He didn't need to. He'd lived it. Alicia walked in, tying her robe, hair still tousled from sleep. You've been up since 5 again, she said. Couldn't sleep, Ethan admitted. She sat beside him, brushing his arm. You did what you had to. People are just seeing it now. He nodded, staring at the rising steam. Funny thing is, I never wanted anyone to see it. I just wanted Mason to know that silence isn't safety. Alicia smiled softly. He knows. He tells everyone his dad's a superhero now. That finally made Ethan laugh, the sound breaking the quiet. Superheroes don't need board meetings, he said, standing to refill her cup. By mid-morning, he was back in his office at Silver Wing headquarters. The building's glass walls reflected the sky, open and endless, but inside everything was structured, deliberate, calm, much like Ethan himself. As he stepped into the elevator, employees greeted him with nods that carried something new respect mixed with gratitude. When he reached the top floor, Robert Hale was waiting by the conference table. Morning, Ethan, he said. Ready for round 2? Ethan smiled. As ready as I'll ever be. The meeting began with the usual report's policy updates, crew retraining plans, and the creation of a new inclusion program. But as they spoke, Ethan's attention drifted toward the framed photo on the wall, the first Silver Wing aircraft taking off decades ago. Beneath it, the company motto read, "Every flight carries a story." He cleared his throat. Let's make sure that motto means something. Robert looked up. It already does. Not enough, Ethan said quietly. We can't just react to moments. We have to build a culture that prevents them. From the hiring floor to the cabin crew, every person has to feel seen. The room fell silent. Then heads began to nod one by one. Someone said softly, "That's leadership." After the meeting, Ethan stepped outside onto the terrace that overlooked the city. The wind was gentle, carrying the sound of traffic and life. He closed his eyes for a moment. Every story left ripples, and he could feel them spreading now, not as chaos, but as change. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Linda Harris. "Linda, I started my first session with the outreach program today. I told them the truth about the flight. I think they listened. Thank you for letting me start over." Ethan typed back. "Keep going. Growth doesn't erase mistakes, but it makes them mean something." He put the phone away and exhaled slowly. Later that afternoon, Mason was waiting for him at home with a poster board covered in crayons. "Dad." "Look, it's our plane," he said proudly. Ethan knelt down. The drawing showed a big silver jet flying through blue skies. 2 stick figures inside one big, one small, smiling. Behind tiny square windows. Underneath, Mason had written in careful letters, "Kindness can fly too." Ethan smiled, eyes soft. "That's perfect, buddy. Mom helped me spell kindness," Mason said. "But the rest I did myself." Ethan hugged him close. "I think you just wrote our new company slogan." A few days later, Silverwing announced its new campaign under that very phrase. "Kindness can fly too" appeared on banners, commercials, even printed on boarding passes. The world responded. Passengers began sharing stories of compassion from crew members. Small gestures that once went unnoticed now felt extraordinary. For the first time in years, Ethan saw his company not just move people across the sky, but move hearts on the ground. Yet, for all the attention, Ethan stayed grounded. In interviews, when reporters called him the calm CEO, he would shake his head and say, "I wasn't calm. I was just clear." One afternoon, he was invited to speak at a university in Denver. The auditorium was packed with students and faculty. Cameras flashed, but Ethan didn't look at them. He looked at the young faces waiting for words that mattered. "When you're faced with injustice," he told them, "you'll want to shout, and sometimes you should. But never forget the quiet voice that speaks with conviction can move more mountains than anger ever will." What happened on that flight wasn't just about a meal tray or seat row. It was about value, about seeing the person in front of you before judging the story you imagine they belong to. When the applause came, it wasn't loud. It was long, steady, genuine. Afterward, a student approached him, tears in her eyes. "My dad went through something like that," she said softly. "He never got to speak up. You gave him a voice." Ethan smiled gently, "Then tell his story. That's how voices grow." Weeks passed. The noise around the video faded into background memory, replaced by new stories, new controversies, the endless cycle of attention. But for those who had been there, and for those who had felt its truth, something had changed permanently. Silverwing's crews started sending letters describing moments where they intervened, listened, or simply treated passengers better. Small changes, quiet ones, the kind that last. At home, life slowly returned to normal. Mason was back to soccer practice, Alicia back to teaching piano. On a late Friday evening, Ethan stood in the backyard with a grill smoking gently beside him. Fireflies blinked in the humid air, and laughter from the house spilled through the open door. He watched the night sky until another plane passed overhead, lights glinting faintly. Alicia came up beside him. "You still thinking about it?" she asked. "Always," he said. "But not the anger part, just the lesson." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And what's that?" "That people can change," he said softly. "If you give them a reason to." Inside, Mason called out, "Dad, hurry. The burgers are burning." Ethan laughed, turning from the sky, back toward the life that made everything worth it. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, Ethan sat by the window again. He opened his laptop, began typing a message addressed to all Silver Wing employees. We are not defined by the storms we face, but by how we treat each other while we fly through them. He read it twice, then pressed send. The next morning, the message appeared on every employee screen. Thousands of replies came back, short notes of thanks, stories of kindness, pictures of smiling passengers. It was more than a memo. It was a reminder of why they all flew in the first place. That afternoon, while walking through the terminal for a surprise inspection, Ethan noticed a young attendant helping an elderly passenger with her bag. The woman thanked her, tears in her eyes. The attendant smiled and said, "It's okay, ma'am. Kindness can fly too." Ethan stopped for a moment, smiling quietly to himself. The words had taken on a life of their own. That was the beauty of change once it takes flight. It keeps going, carried by people you'll never meet. As he boarded his next flight, he glanced back at the terminal. It was bustling, loud, imperfect, but different, better. He settled into his seat, the engines roaring to life. Mason's drawing was folded neatly in his briefcase, a reminder of everything that had begun with a single moment of courage. He looked out the window as the plane lifted off, rising above the clouds where the world looked peaceful again. Ethan smiled. In a world full of noise, sometimes one quiet act of integrity can echo farther than any shout. And as the city disappeared below him, he whispered softly, "Let kindness keep flying." It had been nearly a month since that flight, but the story refused to fade. Every morning, new clips resurfaced, spliced and remixed by strangers who turned that quiet confrontation into something bigger, a symbol, a movement, a conversation. Ethan Cole's name trended for weeks. News outlets called him the calm CEO who taught America a lesson mid-air. Commentators debated his tone, his power, his restraint. Some praised him as a model of dignity. Others questioned whether authority had given him the advantage to speak at all. Ethan watched the noise unfold like weather, never fighting it, never feeding it. He'd learned long ago that attention was just another kind of turbulence. It passed when you stopped giving it fuel. But one thing surprised him. The story didn't just live in headlines. It started to live in people. Every few days, letters came to Silver Wing headquarters, handwritten envelopes with shaky cursive or thick marker ink. Some from children, some from grandparents, some from people who had flown that same airline before and said they'd felt invisible too. One letter came from a boy named Terrence in Chicago. "I saw you on YouTube," he wrote, "and my mom said you made the world see us. I want to be like you when I grow up." Ethan read that one twice, then placed it carefully in a drawer, not for pride, but for perspective. He spent more time at home now. Mason liked that. Their evenings had returned to small things, building model planes, cooking dinner, sitting on the porch after dark with lemonade and quiet music. Life had found its rhythm again, though beneath it was a hum of awareness that never quite left. One night, as they watched fireflies drift above the grass, Mason asked, "Dad, do you think people are still mad about the plane thing?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Some are, but most people just want to understand. Why don't they?" Mason asked. "Because understanding takes listening," Ethan said. "And listening is hard when everyone's trying to be right." The next morning, Alicia scrolled through her phone at the breakfast table. "They're talking about you again," she said. A podcast called The Human Hour wants to interview you about leadership and empathy. Ethan shook his head. I'm not sure I want to turn it into content. She looked at him gently. Then don't, but maybe tell the story one more time your way, before everyone else decides what it means. He thought about that. Maybe she was right. The truth deserved a quiet room. A week later, he agreed. The podcast was recorded in a small studio in downtown Atlanta. Nothing glamorous, just a warm space with soft lighting and 2 microphones between cups of coffee. The host, a calm woman named Elise, smiled as they began. Mr. Cole, she said. Millions of people saw that video, but very few heard the silence after. What did it feel like once the camera stopped? Ethan looked down for a moment, fingers resting on the table. Heavy, he said softly. Not because of what I said, but because of what I realized. We live in a world where decency looks extraordinary. That's the part that hurt the most. Elise nodded, letting the quiet breathe before asking, and yet, you didn't yell. You didn't curse. You stayed calm. How he smiled faintly. Because I had a 10-year-old watching. Every word I said was going to live in him longer than any headline ever would. For a moment, Elise said nothing. The silence between them felt sacred. The episode aired the next day. Within hours, it climbed to the top of the charts. People wrote in about how the conversation made them cry on their commute. Ethan's words measured, soft, real spread again. But this time with something deeper than outrage. It wasn't just about what happened anymore. It was about what it meant. In the following weeks, universities, churches, and community centers invited him to speak. He didn't accept all of them. He chose small rooms, the kind where eyes met eyes, and stories met stories. He talked about patience, courage, and what it means to choose grace over anger. People listened. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they laughed. But always, they left quieter than they came in. One evening, after a talk in Chicago, a middle-aged man approached him in the lobby. Mr. Cole, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I was that kind of flight attendant once. Not mean, but blind. I judge people before they ever spoke. You made me see it. I'm sorry for all the ones I made small. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. Then start making people feel seen now. That's how you fix it. The man nodded, tears filling his eyes. Back at headquarters, Silverwing continued to change. Linda's new outreach initiative had grown faster than expected. She now trained new hires, using her own mistake as the case study. Her voice trembled the first few times she told her story, but over time, it steadied. People respected her honesty. Some said her class was the most powerful lesson in the program. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by her session unannounced. She was standing in front of a group of new attendants, telling them, the hardest part of being wrong is realizing it doesn't end you, it teaches you. Then she saw him and froze. Ethan smiled and said, keep going. You're doing good work. She exhaled, nodded, and finished her talk. As he left the room, Ethan thought about how far she had come and how sometimes the best redemption stories were the quiet ones no one filmed. That night, when he returned home, Mason was sitting at the table drawing again. This time it wasn't a plane. It was people different colors, shapes, all holding hands beneath a big blue sky. What's this one? Ethan asked. It's the world after people stop being mean, Mason said. Ethan laughed softly. Think it'll look like that someday? Mason shrugged. Maybe, if enough dads stand up. That simple sentence lingered long after the lights went out. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. thinking about how change really worked, not as a speech, not as a policy, but as a chain reaction of small human choices. One person stands up, another listens, another learns, and the ripple keeps moving. The following morning, he received an email from Elise, the podcast host. Your episode hit 5 million listens. She wrote, but more importantly, we've had thousands of messages from people saying they started treating others differently because of it. Ethan smiled. That was enough. In late autumn, he was invited to Washington for an aviation conference. The topic was inclusion in corporate leadership. As he walked onto the stage, he looked out at a sea of faces: executives, reporters, policymakers. He paused before speaking. I didn't plan to stand up that day. He began. I just stopped sitting down. A laugh rippled through the audience, soft but warm. Then he said, people ask if I'm proud of what I did. The truth is, I'm proud of what came after. Because it wasn't about me. It was about a boy who saw that doing right doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes it just means standing steady. When he finished, the applause rose not thunderous, but deep and sincere, the kind that came from the heart. Later, as he left the venue, a journalist caught up with him. Mr. Cole, she asked, what's next for you? He smiled, adjusting his cufflinks. Flying, always flying, but hopefully a little higher this time. As he stepped into the car, the city lights blurred in the rain. He looked out at the skyline and thought about everything that had happened. The noise, the headlines, the arguments, they were just waves. The real story was underneath a father, a son, a lesson about seeing the person beside you before deciding who they are. He leaned back in the seat and whispered to himself, the echo's not mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who heard it. And somewhere, far above the clouds, a plane moved quietly through the night sky, carrying hundreds of strangers who would never know how one moment changed the way they'd all be treated. Fame never arrived all at once. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling through familiar streets. For Ethan Cole, recognition was no longer something he could walk away from. The story had taken on a life of its own, played out on screens, quoted in speeches, dissected in classrooms. Every time someone said his name, it came with an expectation. A man who never asked for attention was now the face of grace under pressure. At first, it was flattering. The messages, the letters, the awards, it felt like proof that decency still mattered. But as weeks turned into months, the noise became heavy. People wanted opinions on everything. Airlines called. Schools wrote. Even politicians reached out asking him to endorse causes. Ethan declined most of them. He didn't want to become a brand. He wanted to stay a father. One late evening, after another long day of meetings, he sat alone in his office. The building was quiet. The hum of air conditioning filled the stillness. Outside, the city glowed under a wash of orange streetlights. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, him and Mason at the airfield, smiling beside a small plane they'd built together years ago. Mason's grin was wide, free, untouched by the weight of expectation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from being seen too much. The phone buzzed again. Another request for an interview. He ignored it. A moment later, a text came from Alicia. Dinner's getting cold. He smiled softly and typed back, on my way, at home. The table was set. Mason was chattering about his day. waving a fork around like a conductor's baton. Alicia smiled, listening. When Ethan walked in, Mason jumped up. "Dad, guess what? They talked about you at school again. Mrs. Parker showed the class your video. She said you're an example of leadership." Ethan's smile faltered for just a second. Alicia caught it. "That's great, honey," she said gently. Mason looked at his father expectantly. "Did you see it? They said you're famous now." Ethan sat down, forcing a lighter tone. "Famous isn't always fun, buddy." "Why not?" Mason asked. "Because sometimes people stop seeing the real you. They just see the story." The boy thought about that, then said softly, "I still see you, Dad." Ethan reached out, ruffling his hair. "That's all that matters." After dinner, when Mason went to bed, Alicia found Ethan on the porch, staring into the night. "You okay?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "It's strange. I did one thing right, and now people treat me like I've never done anything wrong. That's not real." Alicia sat beside him. "You didn't ask for this." "No. But now it's mine whether I want it or not." He exhaled slowly. "They keep calling it an act of courage." It didn't feel like courage. It felt like the bare minimum. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes the bare minimum is exactly what the world needs to see." Her words lingered in the air long after she went inside. The next morning, Ethan drove Mason to school. On the way, they passed a billboard with his face on it, an ad for Silver Wing's new campaign. The slogan read, "Kindness can fly too." Mason pointed at it, beaming. "That's us." Ethan laughed softly. "It sure is." But deep down, he wondered what it meant to live inside your own message, to be the face of something bigger than yourself. At the company, Robert Hale was waiting for him in the boardroom. "Ethan," he said, "you've done something no PR team could ever buy. But there's a downside. People are expecting perfection." Ethan nodded. "They'll be disappointed." Then Robert smiled. "Maybe that's the lesson. Heroes are just humans who got caught doing something decent." Ethan appreciated that, but he still felt the weight pressing down. Every mistake now carried more light, more shadow. Every decision was a headline waiting to happen. A few days later, during a staff briefing, a journalist slipped into the back of the room. She wasn't there for a story, just observing, but her presence made everyone tense. Afterward, she approached Ethan. "Mr. Cole, may I ask how it feels to be the moral compass of your own company?" He paused before answering. "It feels like pressure and responsibility, but mostly it feels like a reminder that none of us should ever need a title to do the right thing." The quote went viral again. Ethan didn't mean for it to, but by that point, every word he spoke seemed to travel on its own. That night, he couldn't sleep. He went downstairs, poured himself a glass of water, and stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker. His reflection stared back at him, calm on the outside, uncertain beneath. Alicia's voice came from behind him. "You're thinking again. Always," he said quietly. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You know, Mason asked me today if being good ever makes people tired." Ethan smiled weakly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it makes them human." He turned to face her. "You always know what to say." "That's because I'm not the one they're watching," she said. Her honesty cut through his weariness like light through fog. Over the next few weeks, he started pulling back fewer interviews, fewer speeches. He redirected his attention to Silver Wing's mentorship program, spending time with young employees who looked up to him. He shared not just his successes, but his failures too. The times he'd been silent when he shouldn't have. The moments when fear disguised itself as diplomacy. One day, after a session, a young manager asked, "Mr. Cole, do you ever regret what happened on that flight?" Ethan thought about it carefully. "No, but I regret how much it took for people to listen." The room was silent for a moment. Then the manager nodded. "That's real. At home." Mason began writing short stories for class. One of them was titled The Quiet Hero. Ethan read it one evening after Mason had gone to bed. The story was about a man who never shouted, but always made people stop and think. In the end, the man didn't save the world. He just made it a little better for one kid. Ethan smiled as he read, realizing that his son had already turned the story into something new. Weeks later, Silverwing won a humanitarian award for workplace culture. Ethan stood on stage, lights blinding, cameras flashing. When he accepted the award, he said only one thing: "If you ever find yourself in a moment where silence feels safer, speak anyway. Someone smaller might be watching." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was pure, the kind that feels like understanding. After the ceremony, Ethan and Alicia walked out into the night air. Reporters called after him, asking for statements, for sound bites, for opinions. But Ethan just waved politely, got into the car, and shut the door. In the quiet, he finally exhaled. Alicia reached for his hand. "You did good," she said. Ethan smiled. "I'm just glad it's over." She looked at him softly. "It's not over. It's just bigger now." He gazed out the window as the city lights slid past. Somewhere above them, another Silverwing flight crossed the dark sky, carrying people who would never know how their journey had been shaped by one quiet act months before. Ethan thought about everything: fear, pride, exhaustion, peace, and whispered to himself, "Even good things have a cost." But as he watched the plane disappear into the stars, he realized it was a cost worth paying. The winter sky over Atlanta was gray, low, and heavy. It matched Ethan's mood as he stood by his office window, watching rain streak down the glass. Everything outside seemed blurred, softened by distance. Inside, his desk was cluttered with papers, reports, and a stack of letters he hadn't read yet. The world still saw him as the calm CEO who'd taught America a lesson mid-air. But inside, he was starting to question whether that calm could hold forever. The company had grown rapidly since the incident. Profits were up, morale was higher, and public trust in Silverwing Air had never been stronger. Yet, success came with shadows. Decisions grew harder. People expected perfection, and not just from the airline, from him. Robert Hale entered the office, his face lined with concern. "Ethan, we've got a problem," he said. "There's an incident from one of our contractors overseas. They've been accused of discrimination in hiring practices." Ethan turned. "Which division? Cargo operations in Dubai?" Robert said, "Local partner. Technically independent, but they fly under our brand." Ethan felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "What's the story?" "Nothing public yet," Robert said carefully. "But it's ugly, and if it breaks, they'll connect it to you. The company's image, the whole kindness can fly message." Ethan walked around his desk slowly. "So what are our options?" Robert hesitated. "We can cut ties quietly. No statement, no attention. Just end the contract and move on." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Quietly, Robert nodded. "Look, this isn't our fight. We can handle it internally. No need to open another media storm. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The sound of rain filled the room. He could feel the familiar pull between silence and truth, the same one he had felt that day on the plane. Back then, the choice had been simple because it was personal. Now, it was bigger, louder, costlier. Finally, he said, send me the report. I'll review it myself. That evening, he sat alone reading through the documents. Each page told a quiet story of people being overlooked, undervalued, unseen. And though the company logo wasn't directly responsible, the brand was still there. His brand. The same wings that were supposed to stand for dignity. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His phone buzzed with another text from Alicia. You're late again? Everything okay? He typed back. Just work stuff. Go to sleep. I'll be home soon. But he didn't leave. Not yet. Hours passed. The city grew quieter, the lights outside dimming as rain turned to mist. Ethan walked to the window again, his reflection staring back. He whispered to himself, Do I stay silent this time? The next morning, Robert was waiting in his office. So he asked. Ethan looked tired, but resolved. We're not cutting ties quietly. Robert frowned. You sure you want to do this? Yes, Ethan said. We can't preach integrity and hide when it's inconvenient. Robert sighed. It'll cost us millions. Ethan, investors won't like it. Then we'll earn it back, Ethan said simply. Word spread quickly. Within days, Silverwing publicly terminated its partnership with the contractor, releasing a statement that made headlines again. Some praised Ethan's decision as consistent and courageous. Others called it reckless. The stock dipped briefly, and the board grumbled. But Ethan didn't care. He cared about Mason and what his son would think years from now when he looked back and asked what his father did when no one was watching. At home that evening, Alicia met him at the door. You look exhausted, she said softly. Long day, he admitted. I saw the news, she said. You did the right thing. He smiled faintly. Right doesn't always feel good. She cupped his face gently. It's not supposed to. It's just supposed to matter. Later that night, Mason padded into the living room in his pajamas. Dad, Mom said you stopped working with some bad people. Ethan smiled. Something like that. Did they get mad? Mason asked. Some did, Ethan said honestly. Then why'd you still do it? Because doing the right thing isn't about making everyone happy, Ethan said. It's about making sure you can look in the mirror without flinching. Mason nodded thoughtfully. I think that's brave. Ethan pulled him close. It's just being human. A few weeks later, Silverwing held a global town hall meeting. Employees from around the world tuned in. Ethan stood on stage, hands steady, voice calm. We can't control every mistake, he said, but we can control how we respond. Silence protects comfort, not progress. Our job isn't to look perfect. It's to stay honest. The audience was quiet, listening, somewhere near the back. Linda Harris sat among the crowd, nodding. She'd learned that same lesson months ago. Now, seeing her former boss stand on that same moral ground made her eyes well up with pride. After the event, as Ethan stepped off stage, a young intern approached him. She looked nervous, clutching her badge. Sir, I just wanted to say thank you, she said. I used to think leaders were people who shouted the loudest, but you changed that for me. Ethan smiled. The loudest voice isn't always the strongest. Sometimes the quiet ones are just focused. That night, alone in his office, he replayed the day in his mind. There had been applause, praise, smiles, but also the faint unease that always followed big decisions. Doing good never left him feeling triumphant. It left him feeling humbled, grounded. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Robert. Stocks rebounding. Investors are calming down. You were right. Ethan smiled. He didn't need to be right. He just needed to be real. At home. Mason was waiting up again, curled on the couch with a blanket and his tablet. "You're on TV again," he said sleepily. "They called you the man who flies by principles." Ethan laughed quietly. "That's a new one." "Do you like it?" Mason asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "I like the flying part." The boy grinned. "I like the principles part." Ethan looked at him, smiling. "Then maybe you'll grow into both." Later, after Mason fell asleep, Ethan walked out onto the porch. The night was cold but clear, the stars sharp against the darkness. He breathed in deeply, letting the air fill his lungs. Somewhere, deep down, he felt peace again, not because the world was better, but because he hadn't let it make him smaller. He whispered to the quiet, "Integrity isn't about moments. It's about maintenance." In the stillness, the truth of that settled over him like calm after a storm. Inside, the faint glow of Mason's nightlight spilled across the hallway, soft and golden. Ethan smiled as he closed his eyes. The turning point wasn't the decision itself. It was realizing that real courage doesn't need witnesses. It just needs to show up, again and again, even when no one's watching. The spring sun was soft that morning, painting streaks of gold across the glass walls of Silverwing's headquarters. The city outside hummed with ordinary life cars rushing to work, people holding coffee cups, clouds drifting lazily above the skyline. Inside, Ethan Cole moved slower than usual, his steps calm, his mind steady. He had spent years building the company, guiding it through storms, and now, for the first time, he was thinking about what it meant to let go. He stood in his office, staring at the framed photo of Mason again, the same picture that had carried him through the hardest days. Mason was older now, taller, his eyes brighter. Kids had a way of growing faster than memory could keep up. Ethan smiled quietly, realizing that the boy who once hid behind comic books now walked with confidence, unafraid of being seen. The door opened softly. Robert Hale stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're early," Robert said with a grin. "Couldn't sleep." Ethan replied, "Too much thinking." "About what?" "About what comes next," Ethan said. Robert handed him a cup and leaned against the desk. "You've been talking about slowing down for months, but somehow you keep signing new projects. You really planning to step back this time?" Ethan took a slow sip before answering. "Maybe, but I don't want to disappear. I just want to move quieter." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You've earned that, but just know, whatever you leave behind, people will still look to you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then I hope they look for the right things." Later that day, he walked through the training center where new flight attendants were practicing service routines. Laughter filled the room as instructors guided them through mock flights. On one of the screens was a training video Linda Harris's voice narrating. She stood at the front of the room, confident and calm, explaining how kindness and awareness were just as important as procedure. When she spotted Ethan at the doorway, her expression lit up. "Mr. Cole," she said, pausing the video. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Just checking in," Ethan said with an easy smile. "You've built something good here." Linda nodded. They listen because they know this isn't theory. It's lived experience. He watched as she turned back to the trainees, her tone firm yet kind. Remember, she told them, policy is about structure, but empathy is about choice. You'll face days when being kind costs you something. Do it anyway. Ethan stood silently for a moment, feeling both proud and humbled. It struck him that real legacy wasn't built on titles or awards. It lived in how others carried your lessons forward when you were no longer there to remind them. That afternoon, he visited a small elementary school outside the city. They had invited him to speak for their heroes in the community week. He almost said no. He never liked the word hero, but Mason insisted. As he stepped into the gymnasium, hundreds of children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces filled with curiosity. He smiled, remembering when Mason had been their age, all wide eyes and endless questions. The principal introduced him, and the room went quiet. Ethan looked at the sea of young faces and began softly. "I'm not a superhero," he said. "I'm just a dad who didn't want his son to think silence was normal." A few teachers exchanged glances, moved by the simplicity of his words. He continued, "One day, you'll see something unfair. It might not happen on an airplane. It might be in your classroom, on your street, maybe even in your family. And you'll have to decide whether to stay quiet or speak up. That choice, that one small moment, can change everything." When the talk ended, a little girl approached him shyly. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I saw the video of you and your son. My dad showed it to me when I got teased at school. It made me feel brave again." Ethan knelt down, smiling warmly. "You already were brave. You just needed to remember." She nodded, then ran off to join her classmates, driving home. He thought about that encounter, how something he'd done months ago, almost by accident, had found its way into the heart of a child he'd never met. The ripple never really stopped. That evening, Alicia was waiting for him on the porch, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand. "How was the school?" she asked. He smiled, loud, honest, perfect. She laughed softly. "Sounds like you." They sat together, watching the sun set behind the trees. The air smelled of jasmine and rain. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Then Alicia said, "You've been different lately. Softer." "Maybe I finally learned that making noise doesn't make meaning," Ethan said. "It's what stays quiet after that counts." The next day, Mason came home from school with a flyer. "Dad, they're doing a father-son day this weekend. You have to come." Ethan grinned. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. The event was held at a local park, families setting up tents, kids playing baseball, laughter spilling across the fields. Mason tugged his dad toward a booth where they could build paper airplanes. As they folded the thin sheets of white paper, Mason asked, "Dad, do you think people still remember that flight?" Ethan looked up, surprised by the question. "Maybe. Why, I just wonder if things really changed," Mason said quietly. Ethan smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Change doesn't always make noise, buddy. Sometimes it's just one person being better than they were yesterday. That's enough." Later, they joined the other families for lunch under a big white tent. The wind carried the scent of barbecue and cut grass. Someone recognized Ethan, whispered his name, but this time it didn't turn into a scene. People smiled, nodded respectfully, then went back to their meals. Fame had faded into familiarity, and that was exactly how he liked it. As the afternoon stretched on, Mason fell asleep in the grass beside him, his head resting on Ethan's arm. The world around them felt still for a moment, birds singing, leaves rustling, sunlight filtering through the trees. Ethan watched his son breathe, peaceful and safe, and thought, maybe this is what legacy really looks like. Not the headlines, not the applause, just this, quiet goodness that lasts. When evening came, they drove home with the windows down, the air cool and sweet. Mason woke halfway, murmuring, "Dad, I had a dream we were flying again." Ethan smiled, eyes still on the road. "We never really stopped." That night, after Mason was tucked in, Ethan returned to his study. On his desk sat a small stack of letters, more stories from strangers who had seen that video months ago. He opened one at random. It was from a woman in Seattle who wrote, "My husband used to work for Silver Wing. He said the culture changed after that day. He says people are kinder now. Thought you should know." Ethan read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the first one he'd ever kept, the one from Terrence, the boy who said he wanted to be like him someday. He turned off the lamp and stood by the window, watching the city glow beneath the moonlight. In the distance, a Silver Wing plane ascended, its lights blinking steadily against the dark sky. Ethan smiled. "Keep flying," he whispered, "but remember to look down once in a while. Somewhere up there, new stories were unfolding, stories of passengers and crew, of kindness and mistakes, of lessons learned and passed on. He wouldn't know them all, and he didn't need to. The point was never to be remembered. It was to make remembering unnecessary. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt free. The morning was still, quiet in a way that made the world feel paused between breaths. Ethan Cole woke before dawn, not because of work or worry, but because something inside him wanted to see the sunrise. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself that kind of stillness. He brewed coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and watched the first light push through the horizon. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. It felt like a beginning disguised as an ending. Inside, the house was peaceful. Alicia was still asleep. Mason's door was half open, a sign that he'd fallen asleep reading again. Ethan smiled, seeing the corner of a book peeking out from the blanket wings of courage, the story Mason had written for school. He picked it up quietly and glanced at the last line. Sometimes heroes don't land in applause. They land in peace. He closed the book gently and whispered, "You're wiser than you know. Kid, today was special. It wasn't a business day or an event. It was the day Ethan had finally decided to take a trip, not for meetings, not for speeches, but for himself. He had accepted an invitation to fly on Silver Wing's newest route, a quiet flight from Atlanta to Seattle. It was symbolic, really. His first time flying as just another passenger. No title, no cameras, just the sky and the sound of engines. As the car pulled up to the airport, the world looked familiar, but felt different. The terminals, the announcements, the smell of coffee and jet fuel, all of it reminded him of the place where everything had changed. He moved through security unnoticed, cap pulled low, sunglasses on. For the first time in years, no one recognized him, and that anonymity felt like a gift. When he reached the gate, he saw a family sitting nearby, a mother, a little boy, and a baby in her arms. The boy was about the same age Mason had been back then. He was coloring on a napkin, humming softly to himself. Ethan couldn't help smiling. The mother noticed and returned the smile with polite warmth. Boarding began. Ethan waited until the end. stepping into the cabin slowly. The familiar sound of beeping seat belts and rustling luggage filled the air. He found his seat by the window and sat down. The flight attendant greeted him cheerfully, unaware of who he was. She had kind eyes, steady hands, and the sort of calm presence that made people feel safe. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Welcome aboard Silver Wing." "Thank you," Ethan replied softly. As the plane took off, he watched the ground fall away, highways shrinking, buildings turning into tiny silver lines. He felt that old sense of awe again, the one that had made him fall in love with flying as a kid. For a moment, he was just another soul chasing the clouds. Halfway through the flight, the same flight attendant returned with the meal cart. When she stopped at his row, she hesitated for a moment, then smiled again. "You look familiar," she said. Ethan chuckled. "I get that sometimes." She studied him a second longer, then shrugged lightly. "Maybe it's the eyes. You have the kind of eyes that look like they've seen a lot, but still choose to be kind." He smiled, touched by the comment. "That's a good way to live," he said. She nodded and handed him his meal. "It's the only way that works up here," she said, gesturing to the sky. He laughed quietly. "You're right about that." When she moved on, Ethan opened his meal and looked out the window again. Clouds drifted below, endless and white, sunlight bouncing off them like gentle fire. He thought about everything, the flight that started it all, the silence that became a storm, the world that changed because a boy had been denied a meal. It felt distant now, almost unreal, but the lessons had stayed close. As the plane began to descend into Seattle, turbulence shook the cabin lightly. The pilot's calm voice filled the speakers, reminding passengers to stay seated. The little boy in the front row clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide. Ethan leaned forward slightly and smiled reassuringly. "It's just the clouds saying hello," he said softly. The boy giggled, his fear dissolving into curiosity. Really," Ethan said with a wink. When the plane landed, the passengers applauded softly, a rare gesture, but one that carried warmth. As they disembarked, the flight attendant stopped him near the door. "Sir," she said, "I remember now. You're Ethan Cole, aren't you?" He hesitated, then nodded. Her expression softened. "I watched that video years ago. It changed how I treat people. I just wanted to say thank you." Ethan smiled gently. "You're the reason I can fly today without worry. That's thank you enough." She blinked back tears, then whispered, "We all needed that lesson." As Ethan stepped out into the terminal, the air felt different, lighter, freer. He didn't head to any meeting or press event. Instead, he walked straight through the concourse to the observation deck. From there, he could see the runway stretching into the distance, planes rising one after another into the fading afternoon light. He leaned on the railing, feeling the wind brush against his face. A memory came to him then, Mason's voice years ago, small but sure, asking, "Dad, do you think people are still mad about the plane thing?" He had answered, "Some are, but most people just want to understand." Now, watching those planes soar into the sky, he realized that understanding had finally come not as a single moment, but as a slow, steady change across countless unseen hearts. He closed his eyes and listened not to engines or announcements, but to silence, the kind that only comes when a story has found its peace. Hours later, Ethan checked into a small seaside inn just outside Seattle. The place was simple wooden floors, salt air, a view of the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the glass doors. He sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, waves rolling in soft and slow. He thought about calling Alicia and Mason, but decided to wait. Some moments were too sacred to interrupt. As dusk turned to night, the sky deepened to indigo. A plane crossed the stars, a silver streak against the dark. Ethan smiled, whispering to himself, "Keep flying." He didn't mean it just for the plane. He meant it for everyone still learning, still trying, still believing that kindness could travel farther than cruelty. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of salt and pine. He took one last sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth. In that quiet space between sea and sky, he realized something simple. Stories like his don't really end. They just pass from one person to another, like torches lighting the way. And as the waves kept moving and the night deepened, Ethan Cole, the man who had once stood up on a plane for a child he didn't know, felt a peace that needed no audience, no spotlight, no applause. It was the peace of knowing that doing right, even once, could echo forever. 2 years passed since that morning flight to Seattle. The world had changed in small ways that no one could measure. Planes still filled the skies. People still hurried through airports with coffee cups and boarding passes, and the news cycle had moved on to 1,000 other stories. Yet, somewhere deep in those unseen corners of daily life, the ripple of what happened that day still lingered, not loud, not flashy, but steady, like a quiet heartbeat beneath the noise. Ethan Cole was no longer the man who spent his days in boardrooms. He had stepped down from his role as CEO a year ago, not in scandal or exhaustion, but in peace. The farewell speech he gave was simple. He told his team that leadership was never about standing in front, but about knowing when to step aside. The applause that day was soft but filled with respect. He didn't want a ceremony, just a quiet handshake with Robert Hale and a long hug with Linda Harris, who now directed Silver Wing's entire ethics and empathy division. He had promised himself that once he left, he would take time to breathe, to live without headlines. And he did. He spent mornings walking Mason to school, afternoons fixing old furniture in the garage, and evenings sitting with Alicia on the porch, watching the sun slide down behind the trees. Life had become beautifully ordinary, but the world had a way of circling back to the ones who once made it stop and listen. It started with an email from Elise Carter, the podcast host who'd once interviewed him. Her subject line read, "An invitation. Inside." She wrote, "We're producing a documentary about quiet acts of courage, moments where ordinary people chose humanity over comfort. We'd love for you to be part of it." Ethan hesitated. He had spent years avoiding cameras, turning down every opportunity to relive that flight. But something about her message felt different. It wasn't about fame or redemption. It was about legacy, not his, but the kind that belonged to everyone who had ever tried to do right when it wasn't easy. He replied simply, "If I do it, it has to be honest. No music, no editing tricks, just truth." Weeks later, he found himself back on a Silver Wing plane, this time heading to New York, where the crew would film. The cabin was filled with a hum of quiet anticipation. As the plane leveled above the clouds, Ethan looked around and felt the same old calm that had carried him through so many journeys. Flying always reminded him of perspective, how small things looked from above, how distance softened edges. When they landed, Elise greeted him at the airport with a warm hug. "It's good to see you again," she said. "It's good to be seen for the right reasons," he replied. The studio where they filmed was minimalist, just a chair, soft lighting, and a camera, No makeup, no script. Elise sat across from him, her voice steady as always. Ethan, when people hear your story now, they see it as a symbol of change. Do you ever get tired of that? He smiled faintly. I think stories only get tired when we stop growing from them. Mine was never supposed to be a monument. It was just a reminder that empathy is still powerful, even in small spaces. She leaned forward slightly. Do you think people have changed? Some have, he said, and that's enough. Change doesn't need to be universal to be real. Sometimes it's just one person choosing to see someone else differently than they did before. That's how the world turns, inch by inch. Elise nodded, her eyes soft. And what about you? What did you learn from it all? Ethan looked down for a moment, then said quietly that doing the right thing doesn't fix the world. It just makes it easier to live in while you keep trying. When filming ended, there was a moment of silence between them, that same silence that had once filled the studio years ago during the podcast. The kind of silence that carried weight, not emptiness, Elise finally said. Thank you, Ethan, for reminding people that gentleness isn't weakness. He smiled. It never was. The documentary aired months later, quietly released on a streaming platform. It didn't go viral overnight. It didn't need to. Instead, it spread slowly, shared between friends, teachers, parents, and strangers who saw pieces of themselves in it. One viewer left a comment that simply said, "This story made me want to listen more and judge less." That was enough for Ethan. Meanwhile, Mason had grown taller, his voice deeper, his dreams bigger. He was 15 now and obsessed with film. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Mason said, "Dad, can I tell your story someday?" But from my view, Ethan smiled. "You already are." Mason grinned. "No, I mean really tell it. Like in a movie?" Ethan chuckled. "Then make sure it's honest. Don't make me look like a saint." "I wouldn't," Mason said seriously. "I'd make you look like a dad who just did what dads are supposed to do." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, pride swelling quietly in his chest. That's exactly the story it should be. As years passed, life continued its gentle rhythm. Mason went off to college in Boston. Alicia opened a small art studio downtown. Ethan volunteered at community centers, speaking occasionally about empathy and leadership, not to corporations this time, but to teenagers, veterans, single parents, anyone who needed to be reminded that kindness still mattered. One evening, after giving a talk at a local school, a young man approached him, hesitant. "Mr. Cole," he said, "you probably don't remember me, but I was on that flight. I was sitting 3 rows behind you." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You were?" The man nodded. "I was just a kid then, maybe 17. I remember thinking you were crazy for standing up. But now, I get it. That moment changed how I see people. It made me want to do something that mattered. I'm training to be a pilot now." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "That's good work. The world needs pilots who look out for the people they carry." The young man smiled. "Thanks to you, sir. Later." As Ethan walked to his car, he looked up at the night sky. Planes crossed like shooting stars, their lights blinking softly against the dark. He thought about that boy, about Mason, about Linda, about every person who had touched and been touched by that one act years ago. The story had become something larger than him, a quiet current of good still moving through the world. When he arrived home, Alicia was on the porch again, waiting as she always did. She smiled when she saw him. "How was it tonight different?" he said. "Good different." She poured him a glass of tea and said, "You know, Mason sent me a draft of his script." "Oh," Ethan asked. She nodded. "He called it Wings Remembered. It's beautiful. He said it's about a man who learned that forgiveness can fly farther than anger." Ethan's eyes softened. Sounds like he's finally telling the story his way. Alicia reached for his hand. Maybe that's how it was always supposed to end. They sat there for a long time, the night around them filled with crickets and wind and memory. Somewhere above, a plane traced a path across the stars. Ethan watched it until it disappeared into the dark, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming calm. He had spent a lifetime building, defending, explaining, but here, in this quiet porch light with his wife beside him, he finally understood that legacy wasn't about being remembered. It was about leaving something worth remembering. He smiled to himself, eyes still on the sky. "Keep flying," he whispered again, not as a command this time, but as a blessing. And the night carried it away, high into the air, where wings never stop moving and kindness never stops echoing. The story Flight Attendant refused to serve food to Black Kid. Moments later, CEO Dad fired her is more than just an incident on a flight. It's a mirror of how we see and treat each other in the smallest moments of our lives. It's not about power or status, but about character and choice. Ethan Cole, the Black father, did not respond with anger. He chose calmness, kindness, the rare power to make the world shut up and listen. He taught his son, and us, that doing the right thing is not about being praised, but about keeping our hearts safe from being hurt by silence. The moral of the story is sometimes kindness doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be consistent and sincere. Kindness can change the space it's placed in, whether it's an airplane cabin or a human heart. There will be times in life when you have to choose stay silent and let it go, or speak up to stand up for what is right. When that happens, remember Ethan, who chose dignity over comfort, because the world is only a better place when there are people who dare to stand up, gently but firmly, for what is good. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. If you believe that kindness is still the strongest light in this world, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread stories that touch hearts. Let's keep the flame of kindness burning together, because who knows? A small act of kindness today can change a life.